Welcome everyone to History Gone Wilder, part of Have History Will Travel. I'm your host, the Wilder historian, Dr. Lucas Wilder, and last time I animated the move from New Hope Church to the fortifications on Kennesaw Mountain. Now I'm going to animate the battles of Kolb's Farm and Kennesaw Mountain. If you like what I do, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already, join the Patreon page, and purchase something from the Teespring store or Etsy shop. Every little bit helps. Thank you. With his entrenchments, Joseph E. Johnston hoped that his Army of Tennessee could save the town of Marietta, Georgia. By moving Hood to the southeast, he blocked John M. Schofield's 23rd Corps and Joseph Hooker's 20th Corps from swinging around his left flank and taking the Powder Springs Road straight to Marietta. Hood, upon reaching the flank, displayed his aggressive behavior that made him famous on previous battlefields. He believed the best defense was a quick offense, and on June 22nd sent two of his divisions into battle against Hooker and Schofield's men. They easily drove back the skirmish line, but ran into stiff resistance when they encountered the entrenched Union main line. A New York skirmisher from Hooker's Corps remembered, "They came without skirmishers, which meant an attack in force. We fired and dropped back through the woods and into the open field, over which we would have to retreat for nearly half a mile to reach our battle line on the hill. The men there were working with pick and shovel, as men will work whose lives depend on constructing barricades to stop bullets. Back of them we saw our batteries being wheeled into place. Everything was being done that could be for the fight that was coming." An Ohio artilleryman recounted the destruction his battery caused in the rebel ranks. "There was excitement in the moment. We threw the canister into the gaping guns, and then, like a tornado, volley after volley were sent plunging and tearing through the massed lines, strewing the ground with fallen men. It was a magnificent range for canister, and the effectiveness of the gunners' aim was made terribly manifest. They trembled under the awful fire, wavered, and then retreated in confusion. As they retreated, the guns were elevated, and for a mile they were followed with the fierce storm of shot and shell. The divisions of Carter Stevenson and Thomas Hindman fell back after the attack. The assault began around 5 p.m. and was over by 6:30 p.m., an hour and a half of destruction around the Kolb family farm. In that short time, the Confederacy lost about 1,500 men, and the Union only around 250. It was a very one-sided battle, but there was some good that came out of it for the Confederacy. It convinced both Schofield and Hooker that a strong force was in their front, and the way was blocked to Marietta. Hooker reported to his superior and Army Group Commander, William T. Sherman, that, "We have repulsed 2 heavy attacks and feel confident, our only apprehension being from our extreme right. 3 entire corps are in front of us." Sherman saw the note as irrational. He wrote back, "There cannot be 3 corps in your front. Johnston has but 3 corps, and I know from personal inspection that a full proportion is now and has been all day on his right and center." Sherman was in a precarious situation. The heavy rains prevented his army to move around Johnston's flank at the moment, so he'd have to wait days for the roads to dry out. However, if he waited, that would give Johnston enough time to attack his railroad. Sherman knew from fighting Johnston since early May that the Confederate commander would happily sit and wait, but the Union demanded progress. Therefore, the only option possible at the moment was for Sherman to attack. Sherman made numerous statements about not launching frontal assaults against a well-entrenched enemy, but as the days drug on and the rains diminished his ability to outflank Johnston, a frontal attack seemed more promising. One of Sherman's biographers described his decision as such. What finally convinced him to attack straight ahead was his perception that the enemy and our own officers had settled down into a conviction that I would not assault fortified lines. I wanted, therefore, for the moral effect, to make a successful assault against the enemy behind his breastworks." Sherman called his 3 army commanders together and planned for 3 attacks. James B. McPherson's Army of the Tennessee would demonstrate along the whole line, and McPherson chose to attack the Confederates located on Pigeon Hill. George Thomas chose a rise closest to his line to keep his troops from having to endure artillery fire over a large distance. The rise chosen would become known as Cheatham's Hill, named after the Confederate division commander who defended it, but the location was named by both sides as the Dead Angle. Schofield was to attack a point on the Confederate left flank and also to demonstrate further to the southeast to hopefully draw troops away from Johnston's main line, but Sherman countermanded Schofield's attack and decided for him to just launch the demonstration. The attacks were to be commenced on June 27th at 8 a.m. The attacks were preceded by an immense artillery barrage from the Union guns that let the rebels in the entrenchments know that a major attack was most likely coming soon. The attack force for John Logan's 15th Corps of the Army of the Tennessee was made up of Charles Walcott's brigade from William Harrow's division and Giles Smith and Joseph Lightburn's brigades of Morgan Smith's division. Morgan and Giles were brothers, Morgan being the oldest. At 8 a.m., the brigade stepped off against a salient in the Confederate line, hoping to break it and split the Confederate army in half. The three brigades contained altogether about 5,500 men. A Confederate soldier watching the attack called it a grand sight, with swords glistening in the sunlight and colors flying, bayonets sparkling, and martial tread of trained heroes. Here they came pouring on in column, in line, in mass, filling all the plain below and still pouring out of the timber in the rear. Although some regiments made headway, most were turned back, getting within 60 yards of the enemy, but not getting any further. To the southeast, select brigades from the 4th and 14th Corps were chosen to join in the attack. They were supposed to attack at 8 a.m., like that of Logan's Corps, but most of the Army of the Cumberland troops didn't move out until after 8:30 a.m. A soldier in John Mitchell's brigade remembered the moment he heard that his brigade would take part in the attack. So much for our foolish dream of our soldiers, who thought that our few days in reserve presaged a new status as a pet brigade. Pet my foot, rested for the slaughter would be more like it. The stupidity of this order is enough to paralyze me. However, I obeyed the orders, so far as related to getting ready. This amounted to having plenty of ammunition, a musket, and to divest the men of all surplus baggage and equipment. But the role of Judas is more than I can swallow. I must here acknowledge myself as altogether too skeptical to have the least confidence in the success of the enterprise. I think it far better not to give the plan of operation to my men, lest I gag on my words and reveal that I have the horrors, which in turn would give them the horrors too. I consider the folly of this undertaking of itself sufficient notice for their own peace of mind, so the minutes passed. George Thomas, the commander of the Army of the Cumberland, wished he didn't have to obey orders and order his men to attack the well-entrenched enemy. One of his division commanders expressed that he believed the assault would fail. Thomas responded, "I fear it will be so." Sensing a loss of hope, Thomas turned to his subordinate and said, "If we do possibly succeed, it will lead to a great victory." Just like before Logan's attack, artillery battered away at Hardee's corps, awaiting atop the heights. Although in a fortified location, the Confederates were also worried about the attack made against them. One soldier reminded his reader that we resolved to take what the Lord and General Claiborne gave us and do our level best. John Newton's division and Jefferson C. Davis's division stepped off toward the Confederate works. Rebel artillery began to throw iron when the blue-clad troops got within range. The Confederate musketry began to tear into their ranks. One rebel remembered, "If any command was ever given for us to commence firing, I never heard it. It sounded as though we had 100 cannon instead of 8 or 10. And such regularity one would think they were on parade drill, scattering canister, grape, shrapnel, and short-fire bombs, and, like our infantry, shot for execution." Well, the Yanks got as far as the gully and the ravine, which seemed at that time the healthiest place. One would imagine Vesuvius had moved over the Confederate States of America and opened up business on Kennesaw. Private Sam Watkins of Company H of the 1st Tennessee Infantry remembered, "The sun beaming down on our uncovered heads, the thermometer being 110 degrees in the shade, and a solid line of blazing fire right from the muzzles of the Yankee guns being poured right into our very faces, singeing our hair and our clothes, the hot blood of our dead and wounded spurting on us, the blinding smoke and stifling atmosphere filling our eyes and mouths, and the awful concussion causing the blood to gush out of our noses and ears, and above all the roar of battle, made it a perfect pandemonium." Afterward, I heard a soldier express himself by saying that he thought hell had broke loose in Georgia, sure enough. I have heard men say that if they ever killed a Yankee during the war, they were not aware of it. I am satisfied that on this memorable day, every man in our regiment killed from 100 to 80, yea, 50 men. I mean from 20 to 100 each. All that was necessary was to load and shoot. Daniel McCook, Jr., a veteran of many Western theater battles and the leader of one of the chosen brigades to attack the Confederate works, pushed into the earthworks of the enemy, placing his foot on the headlog of the works, and slashed away with his sword at the Confederates and yelled, "Surrender, you traitors!" One rebel leveled his musket at the man and pulled the trigger, sending a bullet into his chest. McCook fell mortally wounded. He survived long enough to be sent home to Ohio, where he died less than a month later at Steubenville. He was only 29 years old. The rifle and artillery blast ignited the dry leaves on the forest floor, and the Union wounded were beginning to burn alive. The wounded called out for help, and when they did, Major William Martin of the 1st Arkansas tied a white handkerchief to his ramrod, stood on the ramparts of the trenches, and yelled to the Federal troops that this was butchery, to cease fire until the wounded were drugged to safety. Over the next few moments, both Union and Confederate soldiers drug and carried as many of the wounded as possible to safety before they burned alive. Once the job had been completed, the two sides went back to firing. The Union brigades, although some made partial success, couldn't break the Confederate line. Many were pinned down into the afternoon. At 11 a.m., Thomas had sent Sherman his first report of the attacks. He painted a bleak picture. Not sure if he should believe Thomas, Sherman asked if it was necessary to create saps and dig trenches to oust Johnston's men, as Thomas suggested. Thomas fired back, "We still hold all the ground we have gained, and the division commanders report their ability to hold it. They also report the enemy's works exceeding strong, in fact so strong they cannot be carried by assault except by immense sacrifice, even if they can be carried at all. I think, therefore, the best chance is to approach them by regular saps, and if we can find a favorable position, to batter them down. We have already lost heavily today without gaining any material advantage. 1 or 2 more such assaults would use up this army." Sherman decided not to make any more attacks. However, there had been success on the 27th. Schofield's demonstration resulted in a division of Union soldiers moving past Johnston's left flank. Union troops were now closer to the Chattahoochee River than the Confederate troops were. To capitalize on this flanking maneuver, Sherman would need to build up supplies in order to move Johnston out of his entrenchments on Kennesaw Mountain. That night, Union troops ventured onto the battlefield to find their wounded comrades. One Federal soldier remembered, "I never worked a day so hard as I did carrying off men yesterday. It was awful hot. We had to go right up to the front line, but thank God I did not get hurt. I did not know if I would live to go 5 steps. I felt bad, but I said before I started, I will trust God, and started. And then the man behind me carrying the stretcher, he fell, and I dragged the cot for 5 rods and lost my hat, and did not dare to get it, but we got off safe, and I know Providence spared me, for the bullets flew thick. In just a few hours of fighting, the Union lost around 3,000 casualties, a great many of which came from Thomas's Army of the Cumberland. The Confederates in all lost around 1,000 troops. The two sides settled into trench warfare, as their army commanders decided their next moves.